An Egyptian pipeline carrying gas to Israel is blown up, while most Egyptians say they don't want to keep the peace treaty with Israel. Future relations with Israel taking a dangerous turn, and what's the fate of Middle East peace after the sweeping revolutions in the Arab world? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. On Wednesday, Egyptian security officials said that unknown armed gangs blew up a pipeline carrying gas from Egypt to Israel and Jordan. A second such attack in a month, forcing the pipeline to be shut down and people living nearby to leave their homes. The blown-up pipeline, located 50 kilometres from the border with Israel, was targeted first on March 27th, when gunmen planted explosives that failed to detonate. An earlier attack on the same pipeline took place on February 5th, during the 18-day uprising that forced President Hosni Mubarak from power a few days later. Israel gets some 40% of its natural gas from Egypt, while Jordan depends on Egyptian gas to generate 80% of its electricity. Joining us now to discuss the issues surrounding this incident are our guests. In Cairo, Emad Gad, who's a member of the Al-Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies and the editor of an Israeli Selections, a monthly journal on Israeli issues. From Tel Aviv, the former Israeli ambassador to the EU, Avi Primor. And joining us from Washington, Samir Shehata, who's assistant professor of Arab politics at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. Emad Gad, we'll start with you if we can. Egypt's Prime Minister visited Sinai last week and spoke to local tribespeople who've often complained of being neglected and oppressed by the government in Cairo. So, was this attack aimed at Egypt or Israel?
Up to now, we don't know who is behind this explosion, but we can speak about perhaps we can refer to some fundamentalists, some fanatics who are against any kind of relations with Israel. And perhaps we can say that we are seeing some sort of feelings against the Israeli government and against any contacts in any kind of relations, because the story of natural gas to Israel is a story of corruption in Egypt now. Now the sons of Mubarak, Gamal and Ala, now they are in prison. And one reason is the agreement of gas. It's a story of corruption. And also we can see fanatics, fundamentalists, and also nationalist movements against any kind of relation with Israel. And at the end of the day, we can reach to the responsible for that. And in my opinion, I think perhaps they are fanatics, especially.
Okay, we should point out that the pipeline has been attacked in the past by people whose gripe has been with the government in Cairo. Samir Shehata, the agreement, as we were just hearing, to supply gas to Israel from Egypt has long been controversial. Perhaps you could give us your take on why this deal is so unpopular with Egyptians.
Right. Well, Dr. Gad is completely correct that this is a very controversial issue in Egypt for a number of reasons. Of course, there's a minority, and I have to say that I think it's a relatively small minority, that is against, in principle, any kind of relations whatsoever with Israel. Nevertheless, the vast majority of Egyptians are outraged, as Mr. Gad said, at the opacity, the lack of transparency having to do with the sale of natural gas to Israel. It has been alleged, and there is significant proof of this, that there was some significant corruption involving Gamal Mubarak, as well as some businessmen close to the regime and close to Mr. Mubarak himself, that benefited from the sale of natural gas to Israel. And moreover, and this is what outrages all Egyptians, that the sale of natural gas to Israel is taking place at below market prices, and that somehow the regime derived some political benefit for this. And that is something that is under discussion and has been under discussion for years now in Egypt, and is something that all Egyptians feel is outrageous.
Avi Primor, speaking on Israeli radio, the former head of Mossad, Danny Yatom, said that Israel should now focus even more on developing its own offshore gas reserves. Israel gets something like, 40% of its gas from Egypt. Two questions. Does it have alternatives? And is Mr. Yatom right when he says that this attack may be the beginning of a trend that Israel might have to deal with in the foreseeable future?
Well, I think we have alternatives. That's not the problem. We have as many alternatives as we could wish. I mean, after all, we lie on the Mediterranean and we can get gas from all over, just like we can get any other commodity from all over. Remember 1973, when there was a world boycott against sales of oil from Arab countries, and there was rationing of oil all over the world. There was no rationing of oil in Israel, even though this boycott was destined to obstruct Israel. Because we could buy it, it's only a matter of price. With the gas from Egypt, it's not even a matter of price, it's a matter of comfort. It's much more comfortable to get the gas from an immediate neighbor, but if we don't get it from the immediate neighbor, we'll get it elsewhere. And besides, as you've just mentioned, we've already discovered gas ourselves on our shores. That's not the real problem. The real problem is the overall question of our relations with Egypt, and this is the crucial question.
Well, Egypt's new foreign minister, Nabil al-Arabi, said that Egypt will demand that Israel pay the difference between the reduced prices it received and market value on the natural gas that it purchased under President Mubarak. That's the first time an Egyptian official has spoken of a retroactive payment, and marks the country's renewed role in the Middle East peace process. He said, quote, "We will stick to all of the treaties we signed, and we will demand that they keep their side of the deal. Will not be a strategic treasure for Israel, as they used to say during the time of Mubarak. We'll only abide by the treaties." Well, Egypt supplies Israel with gas under a 15-year deal. Since 2005, Israel's been receiving some 1.7 billion cubic meters of gas annually at cut-rate prices. Last week, Egypt's public prosecutor ordered former Energy Minister Samir Shehata and 6 other officials to stand trial on charges related to the natural gas deal with Israel. The prosecutor's office said that the deal in question has caused losses worth over $714 million to the state. Gas exports to Israel have long been controversial for a population that overwhelmingly views Israelis in a negative light. A recent poll conducted by a US research center indicated that around 54% of Egyptians don't want to keep the peace treaty with Israel, as many view the alliance between the two countries as a negative aspect of the Mubarak era. Avi Primor, then, you say that you personally are not particularly concerned that the flowering of democracy in Egypt could spend the end to the gas deal. What about the peace treaty itself?
Well, I don't think that President Sadat, when he signed a peace treaty with Israel, he did it because he was particularly in love with Israel. I think he did it because he understood that this was an Egyptian interest, or at least he thought it was an Egyptian interest, and I could explain why he would think such a thing. And because it's an Egyptian interest, President Mubarak kept it alive, and I don't see any reason why any regime in Egypt should see it differently. That public opinion in Egypt didn't support this is not new. I don't think that when President Sadat came to Israel, all of the Egyptians were very enthusiastic about that. But they understood reason and understood that this was in the interest of Egypt, in the interest of the Egyptian economy, Egyptian development, and for Egyptian necessities. After all, nobody believed anymore that one could do away with Israel. And if you cannot do away with Israel, then why invest so much money in this state of war? Now, what democracy is concerned, I think the more Egypt will be democratic, the better it would be for peace. Democracy is always good for peace. But I can also understand that even today, even if Egyptians understand that they have an interest in the peace with Israel, they also have some resentments against Israel, to say it very mildly. And I think as long as we keep on the occupation of the Palestinians, for emotional reasons, many Egyptians, even if they consider it to be in Egyptian interest to keep the peace with Israel, will be against it. It's emotional, and I can understand that. So I think in last analysis, we'll have the real stable peace once we have peace with the Palestinians.
Emad Gad, Mubarak was particularly in love with Israel, according to Avi Primor. How do you see relations between Egypt and Israel changing in the foreseeable future, for better or for worse?
First, we have to differentiate between hating Israeli policy and peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. I think we have a small portion, as Dr. Shehata said, the fanatics, the fundamentalists, the nationalists. They are hating Israel and they are asking for removing Israel. But we are speaking about between 10 or till 15% of the Egyptians. And hating the Israeli policy and the Israeli behavior towards the Palestinian and the Israeli aggression. So I think the majority of the Egyptian population is against the Israeli policies, Israeli aggression against Gaza and Palestinian territories. But we have to differentiate between hating the Israeli policies and the situation towards the peace treaty. I think, as Mr. Avi said, the peace treaty is an Egyptian interest. But Mubarak reached to a deal with the Israeli side that you have to backing the Egyptian regime to do what he wants with his population, and Mubarak was ready to do what the Israeli wants regionally. So I think this this story has been ended, and Israel must know that it will be a democratic regime in Egypt, and democratic regime means transparency, means accountability, and we have to know the price of exporting natural gas to Israel, and Israel must stop intervening in the Egyptian internal affairs and accept to see a democratic regime in Israel.
Okay, all right. Let's pick up on some of the issues that you raised there with Samir Shehata. Do the Israelis, does Israel have anything in particular to worry about, especially in relation to a potential change in Egypt's role in Middle East peace?
Well, they certainly have some legitimate reasons for concern. Certainly, as was said, the peace treaty isn't going anywhere. That's not under discussion. And I also think that the poll that was taken is suspect to some extent for a number of reasons. Of course, public opinion changes depending on what's going on the ground. And if there's an attack on Gaza, or if Gaza is under siege, then public opinion is going to react quite negatively. And we've already seen everyone who matters in Egypt, the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces, Ambassador Nabil al-Arabi, even the presidential contenders, the primary ones, Ambassador Amr Moussa and Dr. Mohammed al-Baradei, say that the peace treaty will stay in effect. That's not under discussion. Israel, however, does have reasons for concern, and that is because Egypt is going to take a new position regionally. Egypt's position deteriorated significantly under the Mubarak regime because it was pursuing the Mubarak regime's small, narrow interests as opposed to Egyptian and Arab interests. What does this mean? It means that Egypt's relationship with Hamas is going to change significantly. The Mubarak regime tried to undermine Hamas and was not a neutral broker in the mediation efforts between Fatah and Hamas. Egypt will no longer participate in the illegal an inhuman blockade of Gaza, and I think Egypt's regional role is going to improve significantly. This means, I think, that Israel is going to come under some increased pressure if it undertakes military missions in Gaza, if it assassinates Palestinian leaders, and if it is not serious in pursuing a peace that is just and that will produce stability in the region, which of course would be beneficial for everyone.
Avi Primor, you only have to look at the Israeli press to realize how concerned the mainstream is, that the public are, about the future and relations with Israel's neighbours. I get the feeling that you don't agree, that you personally don't share the fears being expressed at the moment by the Israeli mainstream.
Well, the Israeli mainstream is always worried. The average Israeli is always concerned with security. Security is the main problem for every Israeli, whether it's justified or not justified, exaggerated or not. That's the way Israelis feel, and that's the way they react. What will that mean for our security? Now, the reason why Egypt until now supported Israel in its anti-Hamas policies was because they probably feared the influence of Hamas on the development of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt. I think that was it. Now, I don't know what the new regime in Egypt will think about the Muslim Brothers. Maybe the Brotherhood is not so dangerous as one would have thought. Anyway, I do agree that it's most probable that the siege of the Gaza Strip, the blockade of the Gaza Strip, will not go on the way it did. And the consequences for Israel should be to talk to the Hamas. I think we can talk to the Hamas. I think the Hamas does want to talk to us, not about peace. I don't think the Hamas will agree to have peace negotiations with us, but technical arrangements on the borders which are necessary for both sides. I think we have to get used to we should get used to the idea that somehow, somewhere along the way, we should talk to the Hamas, and then Egypt, with a new policy, could be an honest broker. And I think even the Palestinian government in Ramallah should get used to it, because I believe that if there is an agreement between the Palestinian government in Ramallah and the Hamas government in the Gaza Strip, then peace negotiations with Ramallah will be much more comfortable. But what exactly the Egyptian policy will be, I think, will have nothing to do with Israel. It will have to do with the internal situation in Egypt. I believe that any regime in Egypt will decide what kind of a policy they will have vis-a-vis Gaza, vis-a-vis the Hamas, will be based on the interests of Egypt and not on the considerations of Israel.
Emad Gad, do Palestinians have anything to look forward to now in terms of a democratic Egypt and the way that Egypt will defend, promote their interests?
Today, I know that there is a negotiation between Fatah and Hamas in Cairo, and we heard that some good news perhaps. Now, the stereotype of Egypt in the eyes of Hamas team now is very good, and we are seeing also another Egyptian policy toward the Hamas and toward Israel also. So I think we can speak about positive atmosphere now in Cairo, and the Palestinian factions now are ready to talk, to negotiate in order to reach to reconciliation. And if Egyptian policy succeed to reach to Palestinian reconciliation, I think we can see a new Egyptian rule in dealing with the Palestinians and also with the Israelis. We cannot speak about a new Egyptian policy toward Israel without a new Egyptian policy towards the Palestinians. And I'm against any kind of speech dealing with the new Egyptian policy as against Israel.
Okay, so Samir Shehata, Israel has long touted itself as the only democracy in the Middle East. Of course, in the near future, that may no longer be the case. Of course, being the only democracy in the Middle East had certain advantages. What are the disadvantages then, from Israel's point of view, of having now to deal or potentially deal with neighboring democracies?
Well, first, there are a number of caveats that have to be said immediately with regard to the Israeli claim, which was really used to curry favor in Washington, that it was the only democracy in the Middle East. Turkey is certainly a functioning democracy in the Middle East, and it's also quite ironic that the Israeli democracy was supporting Mr. Mubarak's authoritarian regime up until the last moment. Certainly, I think dealing with democracies at one level, that is Israeli dealing with Egyptian democracy, is more complicated at one level, because rather than dealing with one individual, Mr. Mubarak, an autocrat, or a small group of regime insiders, you're going to have a relationship with the entire people, 85 million people. At the same time, however, that is healthier. That produces a positive side, which is you can have a much more stable, much more serious, significant, deep, long-standing relationship with a country if it is based on relations with the entire nation, as opposed to an individual who is arbitrary and could be gone tomorrow, as was the case with Mr. Mubarak.
Look, we're almost out of time. I want to put a question, in fact, the same question to both Samir Shehata and Avi Primor. And Avi Primor, as a former diplomat, Israel, of course, isn't the only country at the moment that perhaps might be having to rethink its strategic relations in the region following the fall of authoritarian regimes. How will the foreign policies of Western governments, in particular the US and Europe, change, do you think, as they adjust to changing realities on the ground?
Well, let me first of all say one thing. This is unfair to accuse us to having stuck to Mubarak. We are not here, and we have no right to dictate to our neighbors what kind of a regime they should have. If we want to develop relations with our neighbors, or with any country in the world for that matter, we have to talk to the government that is in power. And we have no right to preach to them and tell them this is a good government, a bad government they have. You talk to a country, and you talk to the country through the government that is in power. You have no other chance. Now, if there will be a democracy, when and if there will be a democracy, we'll talk to the democracy, and I agree, that will be much better. But we are not the ones to dictate such a regime. Now, as far as the world is concerned, I think it would be better for the entire world, just like as it would be better for the Middle East, to support the democratic movements. It's important to support the democratic movements in the Arab world, not only because democracy is something that we ought to strive for anyway, but also because if we strengthen the democratic movements in the Arab world, and when I say we, I mean the world, I don't mean Israel. When we strengthen the democratic tendencies in the Arab world, we also do everything within our power to constrain the anti-democratic powers, such as the fundamentalists or some fascist tendencies that you can find in every country. So strengthening by all means the democratic tendencies in the Arab world is essential for everybody, for the Arab world itself and also for the outside world.
All right, Samir Shehata, do you want to come back on anything that Avi Primor said then, and tell me what you think the White House will be hoping for in the future as far as the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel is concerned?
Sure. Well, of course, the White House wants first and foremost the maintenance of the Camp David peace accords, which are not in danger, as we said. I think at one level, and of course this administration is dealing with all different kinds of things, at one level they would benefit from, if not strive to achieve some kind of progress on the Palestinian-Israeli front. And I think Egypt, as we said, is better equipped now to do so after the fall of Mr. Mubarak and a new Egyptian regime that is going to be fair-handed with regard to both Fatah and Hamas. At the same time, however, I think that the United States really benefited tremendously from Egypt and took Egypt for granted because the Mubarak regime delivered everything that the United States wanted, including Egypt being used as a rendition site in the so-called war on terrorism, where individuals would be taken from countries, sent to Egypt as well as other countries, where they would be interrogated and in some cases tortured. I think some of those things hopefully are going to have to be rethought out. The United States won't be able to take Egypt for granted anymore, and that includes all kinds of things like nuclear vessels passing through the Suez Canal, unlimited overflight rights, full cooperation on the war on terrorism, trying to isolate groups that the United States deems as radical, like Hamas and Hezbollah, cold relations between Egypt and Iran, and so on. Egypt is going to pursue, as Dr. Gad said, its own independent foreign policy that benefits Egypt and that promotes Egypt as well as Arab causes. And I think that this taking Egypt for granted is going to have to come to an end.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid time is against us there. We will have to leave it. Thank you very much indeed to Emad Gad in Cairo, in Tel Aviv, Avi Primor, and in Washington, D.C., Samir Shehata. And thank you too for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. The news is next here on Al Jazeera. From me, Adrian Finighan. Bye for now.